Thus far, we've learned about the basic tasks of a group leader and how to set up a group. In this video lecture, we're going to learn about the selection of clients and composition. I'll add here that this video lecture is most pertinent to process groups, because in psychoeducational groups, it is, I would say, less common for there to be an extensive screening process before a person enters the group. And in, of course, self-help or support groups, there's no screening process at all, typically. So let's start out with the question of why screen clients in the first place. Now, we know that groups are helpful for the majority of its members. There are, however, some clients who are not going to benefit from group work. I'll explain who those clients are in a moment. Because groups are so useful, we do tend to think of exclusion criteria rather than inclusion criteria. So the question is, how do we best decide whether a person is not a good fit for a group rather than if they are going to be a good fit, because most people are a good fit. So here's how we decide that. The question we have to ask ourselves is, can the client participate in the primary task of the group? And therefore, will the group benefit from their participation? Note here that we're not asking, will the individual benefit? While, of course, it's important for each member of the group to benefit, we cannot make screening decisions based on individual need, because that may lead us away and somewhat prevent the primary task of group from being accomplished. So let's look at what an exclusion criteria might look like then. We're looking here for clients who A, are not going to benefit from groups. They have more intense needs than groups can provide. And that B, their intense need will detract from the group process, because the group will become so involved with trying to help that person that they won't be able to engage in the kind of interaction or dialogue that's required for a process group to be successful. So let's look at exclusion criteria then. Clients who will destabilize group are the ones that we want to be most sensitive to when screening. So here we mean clients who are in immediate situational crisis. Example being they've just gotten divorced, they've just lost a job, they're suicidal. Any of those kinds of issues are going to require more intensive individual counseling work. And if you include them in a group setting, that person is going, and their needs will take up a lot of the space in the group, which could be problematic. And the group, of course, cannot really resolve these really intense issues like suicidality, because it's not your role in the group leader to be doing things like suicide assessment, management in a group setting. That becomes individual therapy in group setting, which is not effective. I'll also mention here that more, I would say, significant mental health issues such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, I'll add in here autism and personality disorders. You have to be careful about not including too many people with those issues, and that when they are in group, those issues should be somewhat managed, meaning it's not going to work to have someone who has an active psychotic episode in the group, because that member is going to, again, subsume a lot of the group's attention. They're going to be concerned about that member. And if they need to be hospitalized, it can somewhat derail the group. So we want to make sure any member with more significant mental health issues is stable before entering the group situation. I'll also add here that schizophrenia being an example in point, there are certain diagnoses that actually are a bit contraindicated for process group work. Now, with schizophrenia, it's well known that in families that have a high expressed emotion level, the person with schizophrenia will struggle mightily with that and actually will become more symptomatic because they don't do well with what we would consider more volatile or high expressed emotion. And so a group situation, a process group, whereby a lot of emotion, catharsis occurs, that could be problematic and could lead to more symptoms for that person. And so perhaps a process group is not the best fit for a person with schizophrenia, even when well managed. Yalom writes that groups cannot move faster than their slowest member. And I think this is a good kind of example and indication of how we have to be sensitive to the individual needs of group members, and if they have too much of a significant immediate need, that is not going to be well managed through a process group. I'll also mention here that in even psychoeducational groups, often individual counseling happens concurrently. A great example of that is dialectical behavior therapy that requires both individual and group work to occur simultaneously in order to meet the crisis needs of the person with borderline personality disorder, such as suicidality, and at the same time be able to run an effective psychoeducational group around skill building. Members must be able to attend regularly, and that should also be a component of screening. If during your meeting with the client pre-group, the client mentions to you, I don't know if I can attend this group regularly, or I'm going to be out of the country for the first 4 weeks of the group, that can be a bit of a problem, because it will, I would say, demoralize the group, who will start to feel like, why should I even bother coming to group, because other people aren't coming, and they'll lose faith that the group is going to help them. So you have to be sensitive to attendance when screening. So how do we screen clients then? We know that screening is important, but how do we do it? Well, actually, Yalom writes that screening prospective group members is pretty straightforward. And this is how we do it. We look at their interpersonal behavior during the screening interview, rather than their past behavioral history, because acts like, for example, criminality or past sexual behavior doesn't necessarily predict group behavior. Instead, what best predicts group behavior is how the person is with you in the room. And so Yalom proposes the interpersonal intake interview when screening clients. Now, what does this involve? Well, there are 2 phases of the interpersonal intake interview. The first is questions about the person's basic relationships. So here we're asking about family, friends, partners, and how the potential group member relates to those people, their experiences of intimacy, the names of their best friends and what's become of them, experiences in social groups that they've had before, people they've interacted with in the past 24 hours and how those relationships went. Once you've had that kind of dialogue about the person's current relationships, you'd move into the second phase, which is what we'd consider more process illumination. In this phase, we're asking members how the interview went for them, what new information was revealed to them, what was it like to receive feedback from the interviewer, what were the most pleasant and uncomfortable parts of the interview, when you said blank, how did you expect me to respond? How did you want me to respond? Note here that this level of questioning is really geared towards detecting the self-reflective capacity of the prospective group member. And if the person's able to talk about their experience of disclosing with another person, it's a good predictor that they're going to do quite well in group. Whereas if they're really struggling mightily with sharing some of their internal processes, that's an indication that in the group setting, they're more likely to be defensive or guarded or withdrawn, and just will need some additional help. Not necessarily they should be screened out of group, though at times if they have a real focal lack of awareness, self-awareness, that could be an indication that they won't do very well in the group. Like, for example, if the person blames other people for all of their life issues, that's a potential indication they could struggle with in the group. I'm going to conclude this video lecture by talking a little bit about composition. We've talked so far about screening. I want to briefly also talk about what kinds of issues and factors would you consider when composing a group. I'm going to focus mostly on gender dynamics because Yalom talks about that in quite a lot of depth. I'll also briefly mention here that the cultural background of the client can be important to look at. For example, in a process group, you want diversity because the more what we would consider heterogeneous group versus homogeneous group, is going to lead to more conflict and more working through significant issues. So in general, you want diversity of race, ethnicity, of gender, of age, of a lot of different kind of socio-cultural variables. I'll also add, though, a bit more of a focus on gender and gender makeup. Yalom talks about when you have an all-male group, believe it or not, the group tends to be a bit more vulnerable with each other than they would be if the group is mixed gender, meaning men and women. And what occurs when it's mixed gender is that men become more competitive with each other. Quite similarly to that, if you have an all-female group, you can have maybe closer cohesion and bonding, and that can somewhat be changed if you introduce men into the group later on. And that concludes this video lecture on screening and composition.